Thank you for coming. I will jump right into the talk because we only have like 25 minutes or so. So this talk is all about automation, right? And what do automation people like to do? Well, we love to write a lot of code, right? Once we get the hang of how to write some automation code, we just like to have more and more and more of it. We just copy paste, we have a ton of test code in our application. But sometimes we are not aware of some of the best practices that come along with writing code. As you know already, like development people, when they write code, they follow the rules of writing the code, they follow best practices, and that is what us as automation people should also do. I will give you some tips and tricks regarding automation. Some are more specific, some are more general. And I will start with what do we want from our test code? So what do we want when we're looking at our test code? First of all, we want something that has a structure in the logic. We don't just want to see a ton of assertions. When I'm looking at a test, and this is more from a Java/TestNG QA perspective, is I want to see some structure to the test that I'm looking at. I want to see some meaning when I'm reading a test, and I just don't want to see a lot of assertions there. I want to see something that is easy to read and something that makes sense to me or to whoever is looking at the test code. I want something that is easily readable by anyone in my team so that if somebody needs to do an update, they can easily do that. I want my test to be easy to maintain. And this means that if I need to change something in my test or if I need to add something, that should be easily done. Think about if you're doing Java-based testing, for example. If you have a ton of code, a ton of tests that use some common code, for example, each of your tests needs to do some login before they do anything, the login part should not be explicitly put in your test, but it should be a separate method somewhere else, and that method should be called by your test, so that whenever you're looking at the test and something needs to change in the login part, you will just change that in one place and not in each of the tests that you're writing. Tests should also be beautiful, so they should have, as I said, a certain meaning and a certain structure so that you can easily follow what is happening in a test. When you're reading it, you should see like certain blocks that can tell you exactly what those steps are referring to. Like the first part should be, now I'm logging in, now I'm going to my shopping cart, now I'm, I don't know, filling in my payment details and so on. If you have just a bunch of code there that is not structured properly, it takes a whole lot of time to understand what you're looking at. And the very important thing about your tests is for them to have repeatable results. This means that whenever you write a test, you have to run it more than just once, right? You know what steps you want your test to take, but you need to run the tests 5 to 10 times at least to understand if the code that you wrote is reliable. So that, like for example, if you run the test in production, the first time the test may pass, but the second time it may come up with a certain error. The third time it would come up with another error. The thing is, if you're writing a test and you're running it against the same version of the application, and like in this scenario, we expect the application to work properly, whenever we run that test against the production code, it should pass each time if the application has no bugs. If the test is not repeatable, so if you run the same test like 10 times and you have different results, then you need to make some adjustments in your tests. For example, maybe you have to add some timeout because some JavaScript processing is done, for example. Or maybe some events in the application happen from time to time and you need to address those so that your test can, run flawlessly no matter at what time you're running the tests and so on. What is the first step that we should take before actually writing the code? As developers do when they have something that they want to develop, we need an analysis period. We need a phase where we define what we want to write, so what are the scenarios that we want to cover, how we want to write those, what are the common aspects of the scenarios that the user might take, so that we can extract the common portions. We can, like, again, if I'm talking about Java, by understanding the user flows, we can extract those common steps that the user would do, and we could just create separate methods or separate classes for those, and we can just use those in our tests. We need to, what I prefer to do before I start running or creating any test is that I like to visualize what is happening there. I like to draw the user scenarios. I like to have diagrams, anything that can help me understand what are the starting points of the user in the application, how the user will progress inside the application, where he can end up, and what are, as I said, the common areas where the user will do something, so that I can write easy to maintain tests and tests that make more sense. Whenever we write automation code, we need to follow let's say, the first principle that the developers would follow. Be as lazy as possible. Which means don't write a lot of code, right? Developers hate writing a lot of code. What they prefer is that somebody already wrote some of the code they need and they would just use it already. If we're thinking in terms of testing, for example, I do a lot of string processing, so I need to extract all kinds of strings out of other strings. If I would create all these methods that I need to do this processing, it would take a lot of time. However, there are all kinds of libraries out there that can help me achieve my goal without having to write that code for myself. So for all kinds of helper and processing things that you need to do, consider that somebody probably already ran into the issues that you're running into, and somebody probably already created a library for that. You can use that external library, you don't have to write the code again, and you kind of have let's say, an ease. You're thinking that somebody has already developed that and somebody has already tested that code, and they're developing on it, they're always coming up with some new features, and that's something that you can use in your tests and you don't have to waste time with that. What we also need to do as QAs is to do code reviews just like the developers would do. Now, I know that many people do code reviews, but not that many people include developers in the code reviews also, so we're not really asking for their opinion. Many times when you write the code, it's only for our eyes or our QA colleagues' eyes. Many times developers have no idea about what is in the test code. We should change this. We should add developers to our code reviews because that will help in receiving good advice from them. Whenever they will see our code, they might judge us a little bit. They might be a bit aggressive towards what we wrote, saying that you did a crappy job or something. But in most of the cases, what they will do is just come up with some helpful ideas that can guide us to write more efficient and better code. So I thoroughly encourage you to talk to your developers, not only in code reviews, but personally grab them, show them what you're writing, get some advice from them, because it can really, really help along the way. Especially if you're doing something from scratch, they can help kind of form the way your tests are going to go forward. So don't hesitate to talk to your developers. And also don't hesitate to do refactoring on your own code if you think that's necessary. Many times you write some test code and you realize maybe after a day or 2 days or even after code review, you realize that you could have improved something in what you wrote. You might be able to do something more efficiently. That's allowed. You can definitely do that. I actually encourage you to do that. Whenever you have a better solution to something you wrote, don't hesitate to go back and rewrite what you have, because that will help you, first of all, along the way. And a very important thing that I've also learned myself, don't write workaround code for your test environment. Rather fix your test environments if your tests are failing in the test environment. So many times you have tests that for production they would work properly, right? Production is the most sound environment that you have. Test environments are not that way. They're supposed to be a copy of production, but they never are. So instead of going in, running the same test in production, in the test environment and making some updates specific to the test environment, fix the test environment. You should not do any workaround code just to have your tests run. Whenever you have an issue with the environment, you should raise that issue to whomever is the appropriate person to help you out with that. It's either your managers who can handle your issue, or you go directly to the people who can help you fix the environment. The thing is, complain as much as you can that your environment is not working properly, and somebody will actually listen to you, and something will be done in that regard. You just need to mention something like, it takes 2 days for me to run something before we go to production, and if we release frequently, then those 2 days add to other 2 days and so on, and people will be very, very open to fixing the environment and making your release process go faster. You just need to have the proper arguments, and something will be done in regards of fixing your environment. Now, this is something that is my personal recommendation. You don't necessarily need to do that, but what I like to do about my tests is to have a separate code project and a separate code project for the production tests and a separate code project for my test environment tests. This is because I don't want to, by mistake, do some changes in production that shouldn't be there. Like, I don't want to delete any users from the database or delete the whole database in production. I don't want to have those moments when I say, oops, did I set up the environment properly? Where did I just run this test? From my perspective, I'm doing two separate projects whenever I have a new project, because also production tests are usually lighter. They are separate from the tests that we do in any dev environment, because in production we do more sanity than testing the whole flows of the application. And because the setup for the production project also needs, or usually is, lighter than what you have for the test environment. So normally you would have less dependencies or all kinds of, like you would scratch a part of the helpers that you have for the test environments. So it's easier to manage your production test, and it's a bit safer for you to run the tests, because in the production suite you won't have things that will drop your database, hopefully. Okay, I have a few tips that are regarding to some specific areas. So I have a few Java tips, but I will just go through them just like that. Use proper naming for everything. Whenever you are defining a method, a variable, a class, make sure you have the proper name for it so that you understand what that class is doing, what that method is doing. Don't name something this variable, name it DB processing something variable. It's easier for you to read and to understand what those things do. Reuse code, I already mentioned that you should create methods whenever you feel the need that, to do copy-paste. Instead of doing copy-paste, just extract that code that you're copying into a separate method. Just make sure that you don't have too many parameters that you pass into the method. Some IDEs will automatically give you an error, and they will say, look, you have too many parameters, like maybe, I think, 7 for some of them. So if you realize that your method has like 20 or 30 parameters, then you should split those up. Or some of those parameters, you might consider that you can generate inside that method. Many times you would just need to pass in some random data, like you can generate some random data based on a pattern. Maybe, let's say that the email address is a random data that you generate. So instead of passing it, you can just create it inside the method, and that will allow you to have a cleaner method signature. Mind your try catches. Try catches are very, very popular these days in automation. But whenever you write a try catch, you need to make sure that you treat all the scenarios through which your test will go. This is, from what I've seen, this is one of the most frequent reasons for tests to pass, even though they should fail. Meaning that people don't think about the try branch and the catch branch when they're writing tests. So one of these examples is, I don't think you can, oh, you can see it. So if you're doing something like the test has to only pass when an exception is thrown. In this case, if you're going into the try branch and you're running the code from the try branch, if you don't do an explicit fail there and the exception has not been thrown, your test will pass. But that's not what's supposed to happen. You need to treat all of the branches, and you need to consider all of the scenarios so that you don't have tests that pass, although they shouldn't. Consider the two branches. Consider what happens if the exception is thrown, if the exception is not thrown. You should do that always. Optimize your imports. Clean up after yourself. And use, don't really use star imports, only when necessary. Okay? Make sure you define variables in the blocks where they're used, so don't create top-level variables if you're going to use them just in an if or just in a test method. Simplify your ifs where possible, so use the short version of the ifs. This will make the test shorter. And there's a clear example there that if you're trying to use, you're doing something like if a Boolean variable is true, return true, else return false. This is not okay, you just need to return the Boolean value there. It's basically the same thing, it's just that you're writing less code, and it makes more sense. write as much stuff to the console output where you can so that you can understand where the test is found when it runs. So if you're thinking about the fact that you're running tests in Jenkins, you usually don't have any output when the tests run there. You just see that the test has started, and if the test takes, for example, 5 minutes, you won't see anything in the console unless you specifically dump something there. Especially if you're using random data, it's very useful to print out the data that you're using so that if the test fails, you know exactly which values were used in the test, and you can try to manually redo the test and understand why there was a test failure. So do as much console output as possible, but do it in a relevant way. So don't dump everything to the console, just the information that you might use to debug afterwards what happened in the test. Use the separation of concerns principle, meaning that your test code or your test class should only contain test-related code. It should not contain all of the processing for all of the things that you're using in the test. If you have database processing, string processing, all kinds of other things that you're using for your test, put those in a separate class or in a separate place. Just when you're looking at the test, in the test class, just hold the test code and calls to the helper methods that are found somewhere else. Well, for Selenium, I can only say, you know, wait for everything. Don't use thread sleep, just wait. Because, yeah, you know, sleeps are hard-coded values and waits are very flexible. You can wait up to a specific time, and you don't have to wait for 30 seconds or something like that if a condition that you're looking for has already been fulfilled. Okay. Yeah, one more thing about Selenium. If you have elements that have a common structure, like if you have elements that are part of a list, use lists to define the web elements. So the thing right here on the right, don't use one web element for each of those items in the list. It will just make it really, really large, and it's not very, very useful. Use lists, and then get the first element of the list, the second element of the list, depending on which one you need, instead of explicitly writing 100 web elements there. Regarding testng, don't create all the test data for all your class in before class. Separate the data that you need into your own tests so that you allow a test to run without having to wait for data to be generated for another test. And I will show you I'm going to talk about two tools that can automatically do some checks for you. If you have a Maven project, you can use the Maven checkstyle plugin, which will automatically fail the build for you if your code is improper. Meaning you just have to add something in your POM file, you have to have a file that contains all the checks that can be done, and when you're going to do a clean install, it will just fail the project because you violated some of the criteria that were defined there, and it will tell you exactly in which class, which line, and which checks were violated, and you can take a look and improve them. If you're following me on Twitter, you can find links to my blog there, and I actually have a post on the checkstyle plugin if you're interested in it. And another thing, if you're using IntelliJ, it has a very good included plugin that analyzes all your code in your project. You just have to click Analyze, Inspect Code, and it will show you inside all of your project all kind of things that you've missed, like unused imports, if you can make a variable private instead of public, all kinds of things. It's even customizable. They have a very large set of checks that can be done. You can choose to remove some of them, you can add some of them, and basically it shows you all of the issues that you have in your code before you, even before you submit your code to your Git repository. So I have to end my talk, and I have to say something like keep up with your framework. Whenever you're using a tool or a programming languages, make sure you follow the changelog and the release, because they always provide some new features that you can use in your subsequent tests. Constantly learn, so never stop learning. You can improve your skills as long as you continue to learn. Find good sources of information and always start with the official documentation of a language or a framework. Apart from that, you have your developers that can help you to write some code. You have Stack Overflow, you have Google, you have so many useful information out there. Just be sure that before you use something that you see on the internet, you make sure that code is not harmful for your project. And that's about it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Corina. So, yes, now time for questions.
Yes. So the first question is regarding two projects. Yes, it's for safety. Indeed, it might be a nightmare when you're doing maintenance, but sometimes you can easily just copy-paste some of the tests or the relevant tests from one project to the other. It's true you're doing copy-paste, that's a bad thing, but it helps you be a bit more like, you can sleep at night better if you know that you haven't done something bad in production. Weights using in tests. I only use weights in my tests. All my Selenium tests are weight-based. I have stopped really using, driver.click, driver.something. I'm actually using my own custom weights so that every time I run a test, I know that I wait for the proper conditions before moving forward, and this way my tests are way more reliable than without using the weights. Design patterns, I'm not really a fan of design patterns, so I can't really answer this question. I'm not really into design patterns, so sorry. Okay. How detailed the result should be? What kind of information you need to log? Any information that can help you debug your tests. Any information that can tell you what has happened in the test when it ran. So it doesn't have to be very detailed, but just enough so that you understand what the test has been doing while it was running. Do you run test in production? Yes. Without test in production, I can never know if the application is still working fine in production, because sometimes you're doing, you're writing tests in the test environment, but there are some differences in production from the test environment. And sometimes in production, you might even have something like the site is down because, I don't know, some network issue, hardware issue, and so on. And that's why you need to run test in production to make sure that the production is still up. So yes. Do you know and use page object model? Yes, I do. It's easier to reuse the web elements that I define, so yeah. Why do I run test in production? To make sure that the application is still up and that there are, for example, you might have some latency issues, and if you run the automated test, you can realize that if your test runs longer than expected, then you have an issue there. This is just an example. Unit testing is not enough to test our automation code. We need user scenario, user flows, and we always need to start with a happy flow. Unit tests are more like thinking inside the box and just doing some basic checks, but the user is not going to do just that. The user is going to do a lot more things, and we need to cover those by our acceptance tests. Sorry.